3 months after the whole thing started, I was standing on my front porch holding a cup of coffee, watching an endless line of cars crawl past what used to be the quietest street in town. Delivery vans, contractors pulling trailers, parents rushing kids to school, rideshare drivers cutting through traffic. It just kept going. The funny part was that none of it would have happened if one man had simply minded his own business. Instead, he decided he was going to teach me a lesson. What he ended up doing was turning his own neighborhood into a shortcut for half the county. And every single morning when the traffic backed up outside those expensive homes, people remembered exactly who was responsible. My name is Ryan Mercer, and a few years ago I bought a small house on the outskirts of a town called Cedar Ridge. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't in some luxury subdivision with decorative stone entrances and community pools. It was just a simple older home sitting on 3 acres of land, surrounded by mature oak trees and open fields. The house had character. It creaked in the winter, the porch leaned a little more than it probably should have, and every spring birds nested under the roof overhang. I loved it the moment I saw it. The thing that made the property unusual was its location. Decades before, long before developers arrived, the land had been connected to the main highway by a narrow access road. Years later, a developer purchased hundreds of surrounding acres and built an upscale, gated community called Brookstone Estates. Their neighborhood eventually grew around my property like water flowing around a rock in a stream. My house remained where it had always been, untouched and independent. Legally, I wasn't part of the HOA. Never had been. Never would be. The road that connected my property to the highway passed through one edge of Brookstone Estates. But according to county records, it was protected by a permanent easement. That easement existed before the HOA. Everyone knew it. The developer knew it. The county knew it. Even most residents knew it. For the first 2 years I lived there, nobody cared. I'd drive through the neighborhood every morning on my way to work, wave at joggers, stop for deer crossing the road, and head into town. Sometimes I'd chat with neighbors while checking my mailbox. Most of them were friendly enough. We weren't exactly friends, but we got along. Then came the election. Every HOA seems to have one person who mistakes neighborhood leadership for political power. In Brookstone Estates, that person was a retired financial consultant named Victor Langley. Victor moved into the community 6 months after I bought my house. He drove a black luxury SUV that looked freshly waxed every hour of every day. His lawn was trimmed with military precision. He carried himself like a man who expected every room to fall silent when he entered. The first time we spoke, I got a strange feeling from him. Not because he was openly rude. Actually, it was the opposite. He was polite in a way that felt rehearsed. Artificial. Like every smile was part of a business negotiation. One afternoon, he stopped me while I was checking my mailbox near the neighborhood entrance. "You live in a Mercer property, right?" he asked. "That's me." He nodded toward the road. "Interesting arrangement you've got." I laughed. "You mean the easement?" "I suppose so." His smile never reached his eyes. "Must be nice." At the time, I didn't think much about it. Looking back now, that conversation was probably the first warning sign. A few months later, Victor won the HOA presidency. Within weeks, things started changing. New regulations appeared. New landscaping requirements. New enforcement policies. Residents grumbled, but mostly complied. Then one afternoon, I found an envelope in my mailbox bearing the Brookstone Estates HOA logo. I opened it expecting some kind of community notice. Instead, it was a demand for money. According to the letter, because I regularly used neighborhood infrastructure, I was expected to contribute a monthly maintenance fee equal to HOA dues. I remember laughing out loud right there in my driveway. My wife, Emily, was watering flowers when I walked up holding the letter. "What's so funny?" she asked. I handed it over. She read it twice before looking up. "Can they do this?" "Not even a little." "You're sure?" "Positive." I pulled out the property records I'd received during closing. The easement language couldn't have been clearer. No fees. No HOA obligations. No conditions. I tossed the letter into a drawer and forgot about it. At least I tried to. A week later, another letter arrived. This one wasn't asking anymore. It was threatening. The wording was carefully chosen, probably by someone trying to sound intimidating without creating legal liability. Failure to cooperate may result in a review of access privileges. Review of access privileges. I read that line 3 times. Then I laughed again, although this time it wasn't nearly as funny. Because now I understood something. Victor wasn't interested in collecting money. The amount they wanted was insignificant. He wanted control. He couldn't stand the fact that someone existed inside his sphere of influence without answering to him. And people like that tend to become dangerous the moment they realize they don't actually have power over you. Unfortunately, I was about to find out exactly how dangerous. For a couple of weeks, nothing happened. And honestly, I started thinking the whole thing had blown over. Life settled back into its normal rhythm. I went to work, Emily focused on her garden. Weekends were spent fixing little things around the property and enjoying the peace that had convinced us to buy the place in the first place. Then one Monday morning, everything changed. I walked outside, just after sunrise, carrying a travel mug of coffee and my truck keys. The air was cool, the sky was clear, and for about 10 seconds it felt like every other morning. Then I rounded the curve near the entrance road and slammed on my brakes. A brand new steel fence stretched completely across the access road. Not a temporary barrier, not a construction gate, an actual permanent metal fence with heavy posts set in fresh concrete. There was even a locked gate section in the middle. For a moment, I just stared at it. My brain refused to process what I was seeing. Then reality hit. My truck couldn't get through. Neither could an ambulance. Neither could a fire truck. The only legal access point to my property had been blocked. I got out and walked up to the fence. Fresh weld marks. New locks. Professional installation. Somebody had spent real money doing this. My first thought wasn't anger. It was disbelief. Surely nobody would be stupid enough to intentionally block a recorded easement. Then I saw the small sign bolted to the fence. Private community access restricted by authority of Brookstone Estates, HOA. That's when the anger arrived. I called the number listed on the sign. Victor answered on the second ring, almost like he'd been waiting beside the phone. "Good morning, Ryan," he said calmly. "I imagine you've noticed the improvements." Improvements. I still remember that word. "You blocked my road. Technically, we secured neighborhood property. That's a legal easement. That remains under review." I could hear the satisfaction in his voice. The man was enjoying this. "Victor, you can't lock me inside my own property." He paused. Then came the sentence that started the chain reaction that eventually destroyed his reputation. "If you want continued access through our neighborhood, you'll need to contribute like everyone else." I took a deep breath. "You know that's illegal. Then you're welcome to discuss it with our attorney." Click. He hung up. I stood there staring at my phone. Emily had driven down behind me in our SUV by then. She looked at the fence and immediately knew something was wrong. "What did he say?" she asked. I laughed, but it wasn't because anything was funny. Sometimes people laugh when they're too angry to do anything else. "He told me to call their lawyer." Emily folded her arms. "So what now?" I looked back at the fence. "Now we call ours." 2 days later, I sat inside the office of a property attorney named Daniel Reeves. Daniel was one of those lawyers who looked more like a high school football coach than an attorney. Broad shoulders, rolled up sleeves, coffee stains on legal paperwork. He listened quietly while I explained everything. Then he spent nearly an hour reviewing maps, surveys, easement documents, and county records. At first, his expression stayed neutral. Then something changed. A small smile appeared. He leaned back his chair and folded his hands. "Well," he said, "that's interesting." I immediately felt hopeful. Interesting good or interesting bad? The smile got bigger. Interesting expensive. For who? Not for you. I remember looking at him, completely confused. Daniel rotated one of the survey maps toward me. "Victor thinks this is a private access easement. Isn't it?" "No." He tapped the document. "That's the problem." The next 30 minutes completely changed the way I saw the situation. According to county records dating back decades, the easement wasn't classified as a simple private driveway. It had originally been established as a public access corridor connecting parcels of land that once existed before the area was developed. Over time, most people forgot about it because there wasn't much reason for anyone except me to use it. But legally, The designation never changed. Daniel pointed to line after line of documentation. Historical plats, county transportation records, infrastructure maps. Everything said the same thing. Public access corridor. Wait, I said slowly. Are you telling me anybody can use it? Potentially, yes. Then why doesn't anyone? Daniel shrugged. Because right now, it doesn't connect anywhere useful. Then he paused. At least not yet. The room got very quiet. I could see him thinking. Then he reached for another map, showing my property from a different angle. He pointed toward the rear boundary line. What's on the other side of this section? County land mostly. Then another road about half a mile away. Daniel nodded. That's what I thought. He sat back and smiled again. Ryan, your HOA president may have just handed the city a transportation project. For the first time since seeing that fence, I felt something other than frustration. Curiosity. Over the next several weeks, Daniel helped me file formal complaints. The county responded quickly because blocking a recorded easement creates all kinds of legal headaches. Surveyors visited. Transportation officials reviewed historical records. Engineers examined old planning documents that hadn't been touched in years. The more they looked, the more interested they became. One afternoon, Daniel called me, sounding unusually excited. You need to come downtown. Why? Because you're not going to believe this. When I arrived, several city planners were gathered around a large map spread across a conference table. One of them explained what they discovered. Traffic congestion had become a growing problem on the east side of Cedar Ridge. For years, the city had discussed creating an additional connector route between two heavily used roads. Every proposal was expensive because it required purchasing land from multiple owners. Then my situation landed on their desk. Suddenly, they realized something remarkable. A large portion of the necessary corridor already existed. The public easement crossing my property could potentially serve as the foundation for a direct connection. Construction costs would be dramatically lower. Environmental impact would be minimal. Traffic flow would improve immediately. I stared at the map while the planners discussed possibilities. Eventually, one of them looked up and smiled. Honestly, we probably never would have revisited this idea if the HOA hadn't forced us to examine the records. I almost laughed. Victor wanted to stop one truck from using the road. Instead, he had accidentally brought the entire city government into the conversation. Meanwhile, Brookstone Estates had no idea any of this was happening. They assumed I was fighting over access rights. They assumed the dispute would end with the fence being removed and maybe a lawsuit. What they didn't realize was that the conversation had already become much bigger than them. 3 weeks later, survey stakes appeared along portions of my property. Then came utility markings. Then engineering crews. Rumors started spreading through Brookstone Estates. One neighbor stopped me while I was getting gas. Hey, Ryan, what's all that activity near your place? I smiled. Not sure yet. The city seems interested in something. That answer wasn't technically a lie. A few days later, I noticed Victor parked outside one of the survey areas speaking with a city employee. His body language told me everything. Hands moving rapidly. Frustrated gestures. The employee simply pointed toward paperwork and kept talking. Whatever Victor was trying to stop wasn't stopping. As summer approached, official notices were posted. Public meetings were scheduled. Engineering studies were approved. Funding discussions began moving through city channels. The project was no longer theoretical. It was becoming real. One evening, Emily and I sat on our porch watching the sunset when she turned toward me. Do you think he realizes what he's done? I looked toward Brookstone Estates in the distance. Not yet. She smiled. And when he does? I took a sip of coffee and watched the last light disappear behind the trees. I think that's when things are going to get really interesting. And they did. Because less than 60 days later, the first bulldozer arrived. And they did. Because less than 60 days later, the first bulldozer arrived. I still remember the expression on Victor's face the morning construction crews rolled into the area. He was standing near the neighborhood entrance wearing a polo shirt and sunglasses, watching a convoy of city vehicles move past him like a man witnessing a slow-motion disaster. At that point, there was nothing he could do. Every permit had been approved. Every review had been completed. Every public hearing had been held. The project was official. What happened next unfolded faster than anyone expected. Crews cleared a narrow corridor along the rear portion of my property, grading land that had sat untouched for decades. Within weeks, gravel appeared, then drainage systems, then pavement. Every day, more equipment showed up. The sound of construction echoed across Brookstone Estates from sunrise until late afternoon. Residents began asking questions. Some were genuinely confused. Others were furious. Most had no idea that their own HOA president had triggered the entire chain of events. During one public meeting, attendance reportedly doubled. People wanted answers. Why was the city building a connector road? Why hadn't anyone warned them? Why was traffic planning suddenly affecting their neighborhood? And most importantly, who was responsible? Victor apparently tried explaining that he was protecting community interests. The problem was that facts kept getting in the way. Public records showed exactly when the HOA blocked the easement. City documents showed exactly when transportation officials became involved. The timeline was impossible to ignore. The more residents learned, the angrier they became. By the time construction finished, the atmosphere inside Brookstone Estates had completely changed. Then came opening day. I'll never forget it. The city removed the final barriers just after dawn. At first, only a handful of drivers used the route. Then navigation apps updated. Local delivery companies discovered the shortcut. Commuters realized they could save several minutes during rush hour. Within days, traffic volume exploded. Cars flowed through the neighborhood from morning until evening. Delivery vans, utility trucks, landscaping trailers, contractors, school traffic, rideshare drivers. It was exactly what city planners predicted. The connector worked. Congestion dropped on surrounding roads. Travel times improved. The project was considered a success almost immediately. Unfortunately for Brookstone Estates, success came with consequences. The quiet, private atmosphere residents once enjoyed disappeared practically overnight. Every morning, I would sit on my porch drinking coffee while watching an endless stream of vehicles move through the corridor Victor had tried so hard to control. The irony was almost unbelievable. If he had simply left the easement alone, maybe 20 trips a week would have crossed that road. Instead, thousands of vehicles now used it every month. One afternoon, several weeks after the connector officially opened, I heard a knock on my front door. When I opened it, Victor was standing there. For a moment, neither of us spoke. He looked tired. Not physically tired. Defeated tired. The kind of exhaustion that comes from realizing your own decisions created your problems. "Ryan," he said quietly, "can we talk?" I stepped onto the porch and closed the door behind me. "Sure." He glanced toward the traffic, moving in the distance. "This situation has gotten out of hand." I almost laughed. Out of hand. That was one way to describe it. "The residents are upset," he continued. "Property owners are complaining about noise and traffic." I can imagine. He shifted uncomfortably. "Maybe there's some way we can work together to reduce usage of the road." For a second, I genuinely thought he might apologize. He never did. Not once. Even then, after everything that happened, he couldn't bring himself to admit he was wrong. He wanted a solution without accountability. I looked at him for a long moment before answering. Then I gave him the exact same response he had given me months earlier. "You're welcome to discuss it with the city." The silence that followed was priceless. He recognized the words immediately. I could see in his face. For the first time since I'd known him, he had absolutely nothing to say. Eventually, he nodded, turned around, and walked back toward his SUV. That was the last meaningful conversation we ever had. A few months later, Brookstone Estates quietly removed the fence. They planted decorative trees near portions of the roadway and invested in landscaping projects intended to improve the appearance of the area. But appearances couldn't change reality. The connector road wasn't temporary. It wasn't experimental. It wasn't going away. It had become a permanent part of the city's transportation network. The funny thing is that over time, I stopped feeling angry. At first, I'd imagined some dramatic victory. I thought seeing Victor lose would feel satisfying. Instead, what stayed with me was a different lesson entirely. Power has a strange effect on people. Most communities function because neighbors cooperate, compromise, and occasionally tolerate things they don't particularly like. But when someone becomes obsessed with control, They start viewing every disagreement as a challenge to their authority. That's exactly what happened here. Victor wasn't protecting the neighborhood. He wasn't defending property values. He wasn't fighting for fairness. He simply couldn't accept that one person existed outside his reach. And in trying to prove he had power, he accidentally surrendered all of it. Even today, years later, traffic still moves through that corridor every day. Sometimes when I'm driving home from work, I pass residents walking their dogs near the road. Most are friendly. Some laugh about the whole thing now. A few still blame me. Maybe that's understandable. Depending on who you ask, I'm either the guy who defended his property rights or the guy who helped bring traffic into a peaceful neighborhood. The truth probably depends on perspective. Why to know is this? I never asked for a public connector road. I never proposed turning their street into a shortcut. All I wanted was access to my own home. Everything that happened afterwards started with a single decision made by people who thought rules applied differently when they were the ones making them. So now I'm curious what you think. If you were in my position, would you have fought back the same way? Or would you have taken the easier path and paid the HOA just to avoid the conflict? And if you lived in that neighborhood, who would you blame for the traffic that followed? Me, the city, or the HOA president who started the whole thing? Let me know in the comments, because stories like this always seem to divide people right down the middle. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who's dealt with a difficult HOA or power-hungry neighborhood board. Trust me, after what happened in Cedar Ridge, I've learned that sometimes the smallest acts of control end up creating the biggest consequences.